If you're reading this letter, it means I'm already gone, and you've been their father for 10 years without even knowing it. Jonathan Ellis had built towers that pierced city skylines, negotiated deals worth billions, and walked red carpets lined with flashing lights. Yet on that cold October morning, none of it mattered. The call came just after sunrise when the world was still half asleep and his coffee hadn't cooled. Evelyn Grace was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. And with her passing came a truth more jarring than death itself. She had twin children. His children. For a man who once left love behind in exchange for empire, the revelation struck like a blade. Willow Creek, Kentucky. A town he hadn't thought about in a decade suddenly pulled him back like gravity. There were two small lives there living in the shadow of a mother who had loved them fiercely, and a father they'd never met. Jonathan, once master of mergers and headlines, now faced the one negotiation he'd never trained for earning the right to be called Dad, and for that he couldn't offer stock or signatures, only presence, humility, and time. Jonathan Ellis was halfway through reviewing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition proposal when the call came. His assistant had knocked, hesitated, then pushed the phone toward him with trembling hands. "It's Margaret Grace," she whispered, eyes flickering with something unreadable. The name hit him like a dull thud, a relic from a life he had severed cleanly a decade ago. He hadn't heard it since the day he walked out of Willow Creek, Kentucky, leaving Evelyn standing silent on the front porch, too proud to beg, too broken to stop him. Back then he had told himself it was necessary, that love was a luxury he could not afford, not if he wanted to become the man the world feared and respected. Evelyn had always believed in quiet things, gardens, slow mornings, handwritten letters. Jonathan wanted stock prices, Forbes covers power that roared. And so when his father warned him, "She will slow you down," Jonathan listened. He left with a suitcase and a sharpened ambition, promising himself that someday when the empire was built, he would return. He never did. Now as Margaret's voice trembled through the line, she spoke words that shattered the sterile silence of his office. "Evelyn passed away yesterday. Massive heart failure. And Jonathan, you need to know something. She had twins. They're yours." The words didn't land. They detonated. Twins. His Margaret confirmed it, boy and girl now. 9 years old, living in the modest, clapboard house Evelyn never left. No trust fund, no father, just Evelyn's careful hands and fading health. Jonathan stared at the skyline outside his window, the glass towers he'd once called victory, now looking absurdly fragile. The room around him dimmed. For 10 years he had built Ellis Holdings on the idea that everything could be calculated, acquired, or controlled. But nothing had prepared him for this: the weight of 2 children who bore his name but not his love, and a woman who had carried his absence as quietly as she once carried his children. Beneath the smooth surface of his success, a truth had been buried so deeply that it now rose like a tide, unforgiving, undeniable. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Ellis didn't know what to do. Jonathan Ellis was a name that echoed through boardrooms like gospel, sharp, untouchable, and synonymous with dominance. At just 42, he had already built Ellis Holdings into one of the most powerful private equity empires in the world, with offices in New York, London, and Dubai, and a reputation as the man who could turn anything into gold provided he could gut it first. His suits were tailored in Milan, his watches custom-made in Switzerland, and his enemies often ended their careers with nothing more than a single handshake from him. To the world he was a titan, relentless, brilliant, and dangerously composed. Behind his icy eyes and controlled cadence was a man who thrived on leverage, saw emotions as liabilities, and didn't believe in second chances, only exits. His schedule was brutal: 4:30 a.m. runs through Central Park, followed by 5 back-to-back meetings before breakfast, then strategy sessions that left lesser executives breathless. He spoke in numbers and negotiated like a surgeon, cutting through partnerships, acquisitions, and billion-dollar deals with the same calm precision others might use to slice an apple. His inner circle was microscopic: 2 legal advisors, a personal assistant named Julia, who knew never to ask personal questions, and a driver who had never seen him smile. There were whispers, of course, about his past. No spouse, no children, no family ever mentioned in the press. He had scrubbed his biography clean, presenting himself as a self-made phenomenon who rose from nowhere and owed nothing to anyone. But there were no photographs on his desk, no college reunion visits. No one knew that the man who commanded Wall Street once came from a small southern town with a name no one remembered except Evelyn Grace. She had known him before the suits and the headlines, before Ellis Holdings was even a sketch in a notebook. She had loved him when he still knew how to listen, how to feel. But Jonathan had buried that part of himself deep beneath marble floors and mirrored elevators, believing that vulnerability was the currency of the weak. And so he became a king, yes, but a hollow one, a man who had everything and no one to come home to. The call came just after sunrise, when the city outside Jonathan Ellis's penthouse office was still cloaked in fog and quiet. He wasn't supposed to be in that early. It was Sunday, but habit had long ago replaced rest. The ring was unfamiliar, a private line few had access to. When he answered, the voice on the other end was tentative, strained, and achingly familiar. "Jonathan, it's Margaret. Margaret Grace." The name alone cracked something inside him, though he said nothing. "I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't urgent." She continued, her voice brittle with grief. "Evelyn passed away yesterday. It was sudden. Heart failure." There was a long pause. Jonathan didn't move. The words didn't register, not completely. Evelyn. Gone. That wasn't possible. She was the one constant in a life he'd chosen to forget, the woman he left, yes, but never truly stopped thinking about. "She didn't tell you, did she?" Margaret's tone shifted, anger laced beneath the mourning. "Of course she didn't. She said she wouldn't ask anything of you." Another pause. "But you need to know she had twins. Your twins. A boy and a girl. Micah and Lena. They're 9 now, and they don't have anyone else." The words came like punches. Evelyn had children. His children. For a moment, the only sound in Jonathan's world was the hum of the air conditioning. He closed his eyes, but the room still tilted. 9 years gone. 9 years of birthdays he missed, questions never asked, milestones never witnessed. Evelyn had raised them alone. Not once had she called for help. Not when they were born, not when they were sick, not when money was tight. She'd protected them from him, from the pain of being half-claimed. Jonathan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry, that he didn't know Margaret didn't wait. "I'm not calling to demand anything, but they deserve to know who their father is, and you, Jonathan, you need to decide what kind of man you're going to be now." With that, the line went silent. Jonathan stood alone in his office, surrounded by glass and steel, yet more exposed than he'd ever been. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a man who had walked away, and now might not get the chance to walk back. Jonathan Ellis had never been caught off guard. Not in a boardroom, not in a crisis, not even in the face of hostile takeovers. His entire existence had been engineered around control. Every variable was calculated, every risk measured, every move anticipated. But now, standing alone in the center of his marble office, staring out at the city he ruled, he was disarmed by 6 words. "She had twins. They're yours." The sentence replayed in his mind, looping like a glitch in a perfect system. He didn't know how to process it. Evelyn, gentle, stubborn Evelyn, had raised children without him. His children. For 9 years, she had carried the weight of a truth he had been too blind to consider, too arrogant to ask about. The thought rattled him. His first instinct was denial. Perhaps Margaret was mistaken. Perhaps Evelyn had moved on, met someone else, built a life beyond the ruins of what he left behind. But even as the rational part of his mind grasped for loopholes, his heart knew the truth. Evelyn would never lie about something like that, and she would never have asked for help, especially from the man who abandoned her. He sat down slowly, his hands suddenly unsure of what to do. The desk in front of him held contracts worth more than the GDP of small countries, yet none of them mattered now. A part of his past had come roaring back, not to haunt him, but to remind him of everything he had forfeited in his pursuit of power. He thought about what those children must look like. Were their eyes like Evelyn's, soft, steady brown like the earth? Did they laugh like she did in quiet ripples that filled a room without needing to shout? Did they even know his name, or worse, had Evelyn taught them to forget it entirely? He thought he had time. He thought he could come back one day polished and powerful, and maybe fix what he broke. But Evelyn was gone. And all that remained were 2 children. His children growing up in a town he had erased, in a house he had once promised to return to. Jonathan Ellis. The man who knew everything now faced the one truth he never saw coming. He had children, and he had already missed the beginning of their lives. The town of Willow Creek hadn't changed much in 10 years at least, not in the ways Jonathan Ellis had. The roads were still narrow, lined with maple trees that had begun to turn the soft gold of late October. The diner still had the same chipped sign, the gas station still used a manual pump, and the church bell still rang out at noon like it was calling ghosts instead of parishioners. But as his black car rolled past the faded welcome sign, Jonathan felt an unease crawling beneath his skin, a kind of quiet reckoning he couldn't shake. This was the town he had fled, the life he had abandoned, the place that once offered him something pure, and he had traded it all for concrete towers and corporate accolades. Now he was back not as a triumphant son returning in glory, but as a man with unfinished business and a suitcase full of guilt. The moment he stepped out of the car, the air felt heavier. It smelled of pine and dirt and something else he couldn't name, memory maybe. He walked the short distance to the Grace home, every step slower than the last. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. Her eyes narrowed, lips tight, but she didn't slam it shut. She simply said, "You came not with warmth, but with something closer to wary surprise." The house was modest, well kept with flower boxes Evelyn had probably tended herself. The porch creaked beneath his weight. It felt like walking into a photograph, familiar, frozen, and painfully distant. Inside, the walls were filled with drawings, school certificates, and photos of 2 children he had never met, Micah and Lena. Their faces stared back at him with joy and innocence, and not a trace of him. For a man who had everything Jonathan Ellis realized, he had never been more of a stranger in his own story than he was at that moment. Willow Creek hadn't changed, but it was clear he would have to. Micah and Lena stood at the far end of the living room, half hidden behind the edge of the hallway, their small frames, stiff eyes guarded. They didn't run to him, didn't ask questions, didn't call him anything at all. Jonathan Ellis, who had once walked into hostile boardrooms and bent billion-dollar CEOs to his will, now found himself powerless before 2 9-year-olds who looked at him like he was a stranger breaking into their world. Lena's arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Her dark curls slightly tangled, her expression sharp with suspicion, far beyond her years. Micah, quieter, clutched a worn notebook against his side, refusing to meet Jonathan's eyes. The room filled with sunlight and the smell of fresh laundry felt unbearably tense. Margaret didn't introduce him as Dad, just Jonathan, and he noticed that neither child corrected her. They didn't ask who he was. They already knew. Evelyn had told them enough to recognize his face, perhaps his name, but not his place. Because he didn't have one. Not really. He wanted to say something, anything. "Hi," he offered, voice catching against the dry walls of his throat. "It's good to meet you." It was a pathetic greeting, and he knew it. Lena tilted her head. "You're the one who left, right?" Her tone was even, not cruel, but it sliced through him just the same. Jonathan swallowed hard. "Yes," he said quietly. "I was." He had expected hesitation, maybe even tears. But what he received was silence, heavy and decisive. They didn't owe him anything, and they knew it. These were children who had grown up learning to rely on each other, not on a father who disappeared before the first heartbeat was even heard. And as they retreated quietly down the hallway, not looking back, Jonathan felt the cold truth settle over him. They didn't see him as a father. They saw him as a man who was 20 birthdays too late. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching Jonathan with a gaze that held no room for sentiment. The children had gone upstairs without a word, and the only sound between them was the ticking of the old wall clock Evelyn had kept since her college days. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice steady, almost calm, but edged with a steel Jonathan could feel cut through his chest. You don't get to show up, say a few soft words, drop off some checks, and disappear again, she said flatly. This isn't a photo op. You don't get to rewrite the ending because you're feeling guilty now. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of her judgment heavier than any board meeting, heavier even than the reality he was now living. I'm not here for a gesture, he replied, though even to his own ears the words sounded thin. Margaret didn't flinch. You don't know them, Jonathan. They've never called anyone Dad. Evelyn protected them from that pain from you. And I don't care how many towers you've built or empires you run, this is not something you can fix in a weekend. She moved closer, her voice low but forceful. You want to stay fine? Then stay. Learn how Lena takes her pancakes. Learn why Micah draws in the attic instead of playing outside. Sit at the table, pack their lunches. Hear their stories. But if you think you can drop into their lives just to quiet your conscience and then vanish again, don't bother unpacking your suitcase. Jonathan didn't respond right away. What could he say? She was right. His entire life had been built on arrival and departure, on control and retreat. But here, he had none. Margaret's eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. They've already lost one parent. If you're going to walk into this house, into their lives, you better mean it. Because I swear, if you hurt them again, I will not let it slide just because you share their blood. The silence that followed was louder than any reprimand, and for the first time in years, Jonathan didn't try to fill it, too. Later that evening, when the children had settled upstairs and the dishes had been dried and stacked neatly in the cabinet, Jonathan sat across from Margaret at the old kitchen table, the same one where he and Evelyn used to drink coffee in another lifetime. He cleared his throat, unsure how to begin, but then reached into his coat pocket and slid a slim leather folder across the table. I'd like to set up a trust, he said, his voice formal, practiced. For Micah and Lena, education, health, whatever they need. I can transfer the first installment by morning. There's no limit. Margaret didn't reach for the folder. Her eyes didn't even flicker toward it. She simply stared at him, unreadable. You think money is the problem? She asked softly. Jonathan hesitated. It's a start, he replied. They shouldn't have to worry about. They don't. She cut in, her voice sharper now. They don't worry about rent or food or school supplies. I make sure of that. Evelyn made sure of that. Jonathan's fingers tensed against the table's edge. I'm trying to help. No, she said calmly. You're trying to pay your way out of guilt. But that's not what they need. She pushed the folder back toward him without even opening it. They need a father, not a financier. They need someone who shows up, not just writes checks and disappears behind a penthouse window. Jonathan looked down at the untouched folder, its sleek edges suddenly out of place on the scratched wooden table. For years, his wealth had solved everything. Won court battles, silenced critics, built kingdoms. But now, it felt powerless. Margaret leaned back, her voice softer but unwavering. If you're serious about being here, leave the checkbook upstairs. And pick up a backpack instead. The silence in the room after Margaret's words wasn't empty. It was dense, full of everything Jonathan Ellis had never been told before. He sat back in the worn wooden chair, staring at the leather folder he had so confidently offered, now sitting untouched on the table like an indictment. In his world, problems had price tags. Loyalty could be retained. Scandals could be buried. Futures could be bought with zeros and decimal points. But here, in this modest kitchen that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and detergent, none of that mattered. Margaret's refusal wasn't just a rejection of his money. It was a declaration of war against everything he thought made him valuable. You think I'm just trying to buy them? He finally said the words quiet, bitter around the edges. Aren't you? She asked, unflinching. You haven't earned a single moment of their trust, but you want to fast-track your way in because it's what you've always done. But this isn't a merger, Jonathan. This is family. He flinched at that word family because it felt both foreign and condemning. He had built skyscrapers, conquered markets, and earned global headlines, yet in the one place that should have mattered most, he was a ghost. Evelyn hadn't needed his money. Margaret didn't want it. And Micah and Lena, his own children, had looked at him like a visitor, not a father. He realized with a slow and aching clarity that trust was something he couldn't buy. Not here, not now, not ever. If he wanted to be part of their lives, he would have to do it the hard way, one quiet, uncertain, unpaid step at a time. And perhaps for the first time in his life, that truth scared him more than any deal he had ever faced. The next morning, Jonathan made a decision. If money couldn't buy his place in their lives, maybe effort could at least begin to bridge the gap. So he offered to take Micah and Lena out to the diner, maybe the local store, anything to spend time with them to try. Margaret gave him a wary look but said nothing, only telling the children, if you don't want to go, you don't have to. They went. Not because they wanted to, but because Lena, ever the sharper one, seemed curious, if only to see how far out of his depth he'd be. Micah just trailed quietly behind, sketchpad in hand, expression unreadable. Jonathan had spent years orchestrating billion-dollar deals, predicting human behavior in negotiation rooms, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the silent car ride to Willow Creek General Store with two children who barely looked at him. He tried starting small talk. "What kind of cereal do you like?" But the question landed with a thud in the air. Lena raised an eyebrow and replied, "We're not 5. At the store, he reached for a branded cereal he remembered from childhood, only to hear Lena mutter, "That one's got corn syrup and dyes." He swapped it out, flustered. Micah didn't say a word, simply followed behind, stopping now and then to flip through sketchpads in the stationery aisle. Jonathan asked if he wanted one, received a quiet shrug, and bought 3 just in case. At the diner, he tried to make conversation again, asking about school teachers' favorite subjects, but it was like speaking through glass. Lena responded with clipped answers, testing him while Micah remained immersed in drawing, barely touching his pancakes. Jonathan sat there wearing a tailored suit that felt far too stiff for this vinyl booth, feeling every inch the outsider he was. He laughed awkwardly at a waitress's joke that neither child reacted to. When the check came, he reached for his card, but Lena stopped him with a firm, "We can pay. Mom always taught us not to owe anyone." That hit him harder than he expected. In trying to play dad, he realized just how far he had to go. Not just to connect, but to be worthy of even trying. In the afternoons, when the house grew quiet and the air turned syrupy with late autumn light, Micah would retreat to the attic room with his sketchpad, while Lena folded paper cranes at the dining table below. Jonathan had noticed the pattern, though neither child said much about it. Micah would sit by the window, knees tucked to his chest, drawing for hours with intense focus. Jonathan, careful not to intrude, once asked gently, "What are you working on?" Micah didn't answer, but later Jonathan found one of the finished pages on the hallway floor. It was a drawing of a family, a mother, 2 children, and a blank space where the father should have been. Not erased, not crossed out, but left intentionally empty, like a placeholder for someone who never arrived. It struck Jonathan with more force than any word could. It wasn't anger. It was absence rendered in charcoal lines and silence. The space where he should have been was more powerful than if Micah had drawn him in and scratched him out. It was grief in the shape of omission. Meanwhile, Lena, sharp-eyed and often quiet, sat by the window folding dozens of tiny cranes from colored scrap paper. She never explained why. Jonathan watched her hands move, precise, patient, methodical. Each crane was delicate, its wings shaped just right, its beak creased into form with a kind of reverence. One night he asked softly, "Why cranes?" She shrugged without looking up. Mom said, "If you fold 1,000, your wish comes true." Jonathan hesitated. "What are you wishing for?" Her hands paused just for a second. Then she went back to folding. "That's not how it works," she said flatly. But Jonathan knew it was. Her wish wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air with every wing she pressed into shape. The house was full of ghosts Evelyn had left behind, not just in memories, but in the quiet rituals her children now carried. Jonathan realized then that these weren't just coping mechanisms, they were survival. And he wasn't part of either one yet. Not in Micah's drawings, not in Lena's folded prayers. He was the blank space, the unspoken wish, the figure still waiting to be earned. Margaret found the letters in a weathered shoebox tucked behind a stack of old photo albums in Evelyn's closet, tied together with a faded red ribbon brittle with time, and tucked so far back that it was clear Evelyn hadn't meant for anyone to find them easily. The box wasn't labeled, but Margaret knew what it was the moment her fingers brushed across the fragile paper. She didn't say anything when she handed it to Jonathan, only met his eyes with a hard, quiet knowing. "You should read these," she said. That night alone in the room where Evelyn had once nursed their children, where wallpaper peeled gently from the corners, and a single lamp glowed like memory itself. Jonathan opened the first envelope. Her handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, poised, and achingly familiar. "Dear Jonathan," it began. "I don't know why I'm writing. Maybe to hear my own thoughts. Maybe because a part of me still believes you'll read them someday, even if they never leave this drawer." The date scrawled at the top was 9 years earlier, just weeks after Micah and Lena were born. As he read, the years collapsed. Evelyn's voice poured out of the pages like music, long buried under dust. There was anger, raw, clenched. "I hated you the night you left. Not for choosing power, for choosing it so easily. There was sorrow, deep aching. Micah made a sound today that reminded me of your laugh. I almost wanted to call you. But then I remembered I couldn't trust what you'd say. And there was love tattered but real, clinging like ivy. Sometimes I pretend you're still here in the hallway laughing at the way Lena hoards her toys like treasure. But ghosts don't feed babies, Jonathan. Ghosts don't change diapers at 3 a.m. Letter after letter, year after year she had written to him. On birthdays, after doctor visits, on lonely Christmas mornings. But she had never sent a single one. Because she hadn't needed him to read them, she'd needed to write them. For herself, for survival, for the hollow part of her that still mourned what they might have been. Jonathan sat frozen, surrounded by words never meant to reach him. And in that still dim room it finally struck him not just what he'd missed, but who. Evelyn had never stopped speaking. He had simply stopped listening. Jonathan found the journal buried beneath a stack of children's storybooks in a linen-wrapped box Evelyn had kept in the hallway closet, hidden but not locked. Its cover was worn, the spine cracked from years of quiet entries, its pages filled with ink that had faded just enough to suggest time, but not distance. He hesitated before opening it, afraid of what he might find of what truths Evelyn had chosen to write only for herself. The first entries were simple notes about the twins' sleep patterns, their milestones, her daily worries. But as the pages turned, the words deepened into confessions intimate and unfiltered, written without the burden of being read. "I still dream about him sometimes," she wrote in one dated just after Lena's 3rd birthday. "Not the man he became, but the boy I loved. The one who made promises under the willow tree and actually meant them before ambition made him forget." Jonathan read slowly, absorbing each line like a wound reopening. Evelyn had loved him, of that there was no question. But what stunned him most was not her bitterness, which he expected, but her forgiveness. "I don't hate him," she had written one rainy April. "I hated what he did. I hated the silence. But deep down I think I knew he was scared. And I forgave him for that. I just couldn't let him back in, not with the children. Not without proof that he was someone who would stay." That line stayed with Jonathan, echoing louder than any boardroom applause he had ever earned. She hadn't shut the door entirely. She had waited not for an apology, not for money, but for consistency, for presence. For him to fight for what he'd left behind. But he never came. And so she did what she had to. She built a life around absence. "I stayed quiet," she wrote later. "Not because I was weak, but because I refused to beg to be seen. I owed my children strength, not sorrow." Jonathan closed the journal slowly, his chest heavy with the weight of all the silent years. He hadn't just abandoned Evelyn. He had forfeited the chance to be forgiven, while it still mattered. And now all he had left were pages of a woman who loved him more than he deserved, but who chose silence because he made speaking pointless. Jonathan arrived at the Willow Creek Cemetery just after dawn, before the sun had fully risen, and before the frost on the headstones had begun to melt. The caretaker recognized him but said nothing, only nodded once and gestured toward the far end of the grounds where Evelyn Grace had been laid to rest beneath the sweeping limbs of an old sycamore tree. Jonathan walked slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes, a sound that felt out of place in this quiet field of memory. He carried no flowers, no umbrella, just the weight of 9 years of absence and the ache of what he could never now give. When he reached her grave, he stopped. The headstone was simple, elegant, her name, her dates, and a line that read, "She lived quietly, but loved fiercely." He didn't know who had chosen it, but the moment he read those words, his knees buckled, and he sat heavily, unceremoniously on the cold ground before it. He sat for hours, not speaking, not moving, just watching the wind ripple through the grass and dead leaves collect along the edge of her marker. Time lost its grip on him. He spoke eventually, not loudly, not expecting a response, just needing to let the words out. "I read your letters," he said, his voice rough from disuse and grief. "And your journal. You forgave me. And I never even knew." He let out a bitter laugh, one that dissolved into silence. "You waited for me to come back. And I didn't. Not because I didn't care, but because I thought I had more time, because I thought ambition would fill the void. It didn't." He looked up at the sky. Gray. Empty. "You were the only person who ever saw me before the world knew my name. And I left you behind like you were temporary." His voice cracked as he leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against the stone like a man trying to feel something through centuries of earth. "I didn't even know about Micah and Lena. I didn't get the chance to hold them, to be there for their first steps, their nightmares, their birthdays. I missed everything." The breeze picked up, stirring the dead leaves into a brief dance, as if the world was reminding him it still moved with or without him. "They don't call me Dad," he whispered. "They don't owe me that. I just want to be someone they don't hate." He sat in silence again for what felt like hours. People came and went. The sun climbed and began to sink. Still he stayed rooted beside the woman who had once been his future, and who had become the past he could never reclaim. Only now did he understand presence couldn't be retroactively offered. Love had to be shown when it mattered. He had built empires in Evelyn's absence, but none of it could bring her back. Margaret stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, her eyes fixed on the narrow gravel road beyond the maple trees. She didn't turn to face Jonathan when she spoke, only stared forward, as if the memories played out on the fogged glass before her. "You know," she began slowly, her voice low and edged with a quiet kind of fury. "Evelyn worked 2 jobs for most of the past 9 years. Not because she had to at first, Lord knows I offered, and so did the church, the school, even the Thompsons down the road when they heard she was raising the twins alone. But she refused every single one. Not out of pride the way people assume, but because she wanted her children to see her stand on her own 2 feet. She used to say, 'If I take handouts, they'll think we're meant to be pitied. I won't have that.'" Margaret finally turned toward him, her gaze sharp, unwavering. "She cleaned houses during the day, other people's houses, some of them folks we used to know from school, people who had no business acting like they were above her. Then she'd come home, fix dinner, tuck the kids in, and go right back out to work the night shift at Millie's diner. She'd come home at 2 in the morning smelling like grease and dish soap, barely able to keep her eyes open. And do it all again the next day." Jonathan didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry, as if shame itself had taken up residence there. Margaret continued more quietly now. "She never asked for a thing. I offered to watch the twins. She said no. They're my responsibility. I tried slipping her money once, left it in an envelope under her windshield wiper. She walked 3 miles to give it back. I'll never forget what she said. If I let go of my dignity now, what's left to teach them when they're old enough to see how the world works?" Margaret's voice trembled slightly then, but she cleared her throat and steadied it. That's the kind of mother she was. Fierce, silent, always moving forward, even when she was breaking inside. You may have built Ellis Holdings, Jonathan, but Evelyn, she built a life. Alone. Without headlines. Without applause. She paid for their clothes one shift at a time. Skipped meals when the heating bill ran high. Stayed up with Micah during his fevers, braided Lena's hair before school. Every single day. She turned back to the window, her voice now nearly a whisper. And the hardest part, she never spoke badly of you. Not once. She could have poisoned their hearts against you. But she didn't. She left the page blank, waiting for you to fill it in yourself. Jonathan stood frozen, the weight of her words settling like lead in his chest. It wasn't just what Evelyn had endured. It was how quietly she had endured it, how intentionally she had protected his name, even when he hadn't earned it. And now he realized everything he gave would always arrive too late. It was a Sunday morning 10 years ago, and the house had been silent in that strange, tense way that comes right before something breaks. The suitcase sat by the door, half open like a question left unanswered. Evelyn had made coffee, but neither of them drank it. The steam curled into the air, then vanished like everything else between them. Jonathan stood in the hallway, his hands clenched at his sides, not out of anger, but out of paralysis. He had said nothing. She had said less. And still the silence was louder than any fight could have been. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't beg him to stay. She simply stood at the window in her worn gray sweater, one hand resting gently over the small swell of her stomach that he hadn't even touched since the day they found out she was pregnant. The child had terrified him. No, not the child, but what it represented: permanence, vulnerability, the death of the version of himself that had room only for ambition and upward motion. She turned slightly when she sensed him shifting, her eyes catching his just long enough to say all the things her mouth wouldn't. "You don't have to go, but I won't chase you if you do." And so he went. He picked up the suitcase, stepped outside into the cold morning, and closed the door behind him without looking back. The latch clicking into place felt like a lock on more than just wood. It was the sound of a chapter closing, of a promise dissolving. He walked to the car. His driver stood waiting, expressionless, holding the door open like this was just another business trip. Jonathan didn't speak on the ride to the airport. He didn't respond to the texts from his assistant confirming board meetings or flight arrangements. He stared out the window as cornfields blurred past, as Evelyn's house receded into the kind of memory that gets swallowed by time and silence. In the years that followed, he told himself she was better off. He convinced himself he would have been a burden, a complication, a poor excuse for a father who would have resented the life he gave up. But the truth, as it always does, had its own shape. The truth was, he had been afraid. Not of Evelyn, not even of fatherhood, but of what staying would have required: slowing down, growing up, choosing love over legacy. And that day he hadn't been ready. Now, as he stood again in the house he'd left behind, the silence returned, not angry this time, but mournful, as if the walls themselves remembered the moment he walked away. A decade later, the coffee mugs were gone, the suitcase replaced by grief, and the only thing still intact was the space he left behind, gaping unspoken and echoing with everything he never said. It started with a fever, nothing alarming at first, just a slight warmth in Micah's forehead one gray morning before school. Margaret thought it was the flu going around, gave him ginger tea and Tylenol, and let him stay home with Lena curled up beside him on the couch, sketch pad in hand. But by the next evening, the fever had climbed to 103, and Micah complained of sharp stomach pain, his face pale and sweaty, his breath short and uneven. By the time Margaret bundled him into the back seat of the car, he was too weak to speak. The drive to the county hospital felt like it took forever, even though it was only 15 miles. Jonathan had been on his way back to Chicago when the call came. It was Lena's voice, quiet, trembling, saying, "Uncle Jonathan, Micah won't wake up." His blood turned cold. He turned the car around without thinking, leaving his assistant shouting through Bluetooth about rescheduled meetings and investor calls. He didn't care. Nothing mattered except getting back. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as doctors moved in and out of the room, their clipped voices and medical jargon like static in his ears. Words like autoimmune and neurological response and rare inflammatory markers floated around him. A pediatric specialist was called in from the city. Tests were run, blood drawn, scans ordered. Still, there were no clear answers, just theories. The phrase complex diagnosis kept coming up along with a possibility of PIMS, a rare post-viral syndrome. Jonathan sat beside Micah's hospital bed, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven rhythms, his small hands limp against the sheets. Machines beeped quietly in the background. The IV line in his arm made Jonathan's stomach twist. Margaret stood at the door, arms crossed tight, as if holding herself together through sheer force. Lena sat in the corner, folding paper cranes, one after the other, lining them along the windowsill like a quiet prayer chain. "He was fine last week," Margaret whispered once, mostly to herself. "He was drawing. He was laughing." Jonathan didn't speak. What could he say? That he'd only known his son for a handful of days and already feared he wouldn't survive long enough for them to build something real. That he'd wasted years chasing boardroom deals, while Micah learned to color inside the lines without a father. That night, while Micah slept beneath a thin hospital blanket. Jonathan stayed awake in the chair by his side, reading every article he could find, calling specialists he barely remembered from charity galas, pulling every string Ellis Holdings had to bring help to a rural hospital not built for this kind of crisis. But beneath all the frantic motion was something far more terrifying. An unbearable truth settling deep into his chest. He had finally shown up, and now he might lose his son before he ever got the chance to become his father. Jonathan didn't leave the hospital. Not that day, not the day after, not even when the nurses suggested he go home for a change of clothes or a warm meal. He refused. He slept in the stiff reclining chair beside Micah's bed, showered in the staff locker room, ate from the vending machine in the hallway, and kept his eyes on the monitors as if willing them to remain steady. Every morning he folded a paper crane. At first it was a gesture of desperation, clumsy, imperfect, a memory half recalled from an old story. Evelyn used to tell something about 1,000 cranes bringing healing or hope or miracles. He didn't care how foolish it looked. He folded with shaky hands and pressed the creases hard, placing each bird beside Micah's bed on the metal tray table, silently naming each one for something he wished he could give his son: strength, time, joy, forgiveness. On the second day, Lena noticed. She didn't say anything at first. She simply paused at the door during visiting hours, her gaze flicking from the birds to her father's face, then to Micah's pale body beneath the tangled sheets. Jonathan caught her watching and nodded once, not a greeting, but a quiet invitation. The next morning, when he returned from washing up, he found a new crane folded beside his own. It was neater than his more precise. Pale pink. Lena didn't mention it when she arrived later that day, but she did glance toward the growing row of cranes as she pulled her sketchbook from her backpack and settled into her usual chair by the window. By the end of the week, the tray table was full and Jonathan had started lining the windowsill just beneath Lena's paper birds. Their silent collaboration grew each day. His cranes were awkward and wide-winged, hers delicate and sharp, like the girl herself. They never spoke about it. It became a ritual of shared presence, a language neither needed to explain. Nurses began to take notice. One even brought a small basket to hold them. A doctor paused one evening and asked Jonathan if the folding helped him cope. Jonathan simply replied, "It helps me stay." Because that's what mattered now: staying. Not fixing, not funding, not retreating into strategy. Just staying. Being there. Breathing the same air as his son and daughter. Letting them see that he would not disappear this time. Not when it got hard. Not when it got terrifying. Not when there was nothing left to offer but folded paper and a hand to hold. As the days blurred together, the cranes became more than just symbols. They were markers of time, of hope, of transformation, not just for Micah, but for Jonathan too. And though Lena never said a word, she watched her father. Closely. Not with trust, not yet, but with curiosity. With a flicker of cautious belief. Because in the quiet rhythm of folded paper, something unspoken was beginning to mend. It was nearly midnight when Margaret returned to the hospital. The corridors hushed except for the low hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's footsteps. She hadn't planned to come back that late, but Something, perhaps worry, perhaps instinct, had urged her to check on Micah and reluctantly on Jonathan too. She moved quietly past the front desk down the familiar hallway to room 207 where soft light spilled from the slightly open door. Expecting to find Jonathan in his usual spot beside the bed, hunched forward in the recliner with a blanket draped over his knees and another crane folded at his feet, she was startled when she stepped into the room and didn't see him at all, at least not at first. It wasn't until her eyes adjusted to the dimness that she spotted him curled up on the floor near the far side of Micah's bed, his back against the wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest as if trying to shield himself from more than just the cold. His suit jacket was balled up under his head like a makeshift pillow, his expensive watch turned inward against his wrist, his long frame folded awkwardly into the small space between the bed and the radiator. He looked utterly unlike the Jonathan Ellis she remembered, the man who had once walked away with straight shoulders and cold certainty, who had traded love for legacy, who had chosen silence over apology. This version of him, asleep on the linoleum floor in wrinkled clothes with his tie discarded and his breathing shallow, looked human, defenseless, even a little lost. For a long moment, Margaret just stood there, one hand gripping the strap of her tote bag, the other hovering over the light switch. She could have left then, could have turned away, let him sleep, let him be. But instead, something inside her, old, stubborn, and begrudgingly maternal, softened. She stepped into the room as quietly as she could, opened the small storage cabinet by the wall, and pulled out one of the spare hospital blankets folded neatly on the shelf. Without a word, she approached the man on the floor and gently unfolded the blanket, laying it over his body with slow, deliberate care, as if afraid even the act of kindness might wake him. He stirred slightly but didn't open his eyes. His brow remained furrowed in sleep, as though still wrestling demons behind closed lids. Margaret looked at him for a moment longer, then turned to Micah, still unconscious, still fragile, and whispered a silent promise to Evelyn. Then she stepped back, pulling the door closed behind her with the same quiet grace Evelyn once had, letting the father sleep on the floor beside the son he was finally learning how to love. In the heart of Manhattan, where glass towers sliced through the morning fog and the city pulsed with an electric urgency, Vanessa Cole stood in the corner office of the Ellis Holdings skyscraper, surveying the skyline like a general preparing for war. She wore power-like armor navy silk blouse, tailored slacks heels that clicked with intention on polished marble. On her desk, a meticulously organized portfolio of the upcoming merger gleamed under the warm light, each page annotated, every figure triple-checked. The deal was massive, an acquisition that would vault Ellis Holdings into an even higher stratosphere, solidifying its dominance across tech, real estate, and infrastructure. Vanessa had worked years for this, carving out her influence in an empire originally built by Jonathan Ellis, but silently sustained by her relentless precision. She'd been at his side for over a decade, his business strategist, his fixer, and for a time the woman he didn't leave behind. Their romance had burned quietly, professionally, the kind of affair that never unraveled into messiness because Vanessa didn't allow mess. But that was years ago. Now her relationship with Jonathan was transactional, clean, high-functioning, or at least it had been until he disappeared, until he left a high-stakes negotiation on the table, with a vague excuse about personal matters, flying off to some nowhere town in Kentucky. For days she'd handled his absence like she always did, with calm efficiency and zero tolerance for weakness. But now the board was growing restless. Competitors were sniffing for signs of instability, and Vanessa was tired of covering for a man who once never needed covering. She paced behind the desk, phone pressed to her ear, firing off instructions to junior executives who never worked fast enough. Tell Rothman we're not moving the valuation down, not a cent. If he doesn't like it, we walk. And prep the revised LOI by end of day. I want it airtight. I want it. She hung up and turned to the mirror behind her desk. Her expression was flawless, sharp, commanding, untouched by emotion. But beneath the surface, a quiet fury simmered. Jonathan's silence wasn't just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. She knew him too well. He didn't go off-grid unless something seismic had shifted. And now she was left to contain the fallout, maintain appearances, and still drive one of the largest deals of the decade across the finish line. She opened her laptop, glanced at the calendar, and stared at the empty space where Jonathan should have been. Vanessa Cole didn't fear chaos, she neutralized it. But this time she could feel the ground shifting beneath her heels. And for the first time in years she wondered if Jonathan Ellis, the man she had once almost loved, was about to make the one mistake she couldn't clean up, choosing someone over the empire they had built together. The call came just after dawn, slicing through the stillness of the hospital room like a blade. Jonathan stood near the window, sipping stale coffee, eyes heavy from another sleepless night beside Micah's bed, when his phone buzzed, screen flashing with Vanessa Cole's name. He hesitated for a moment, torn between the quiet breath of his son behind him and the storm he knew was waiting on the other end of the line. He answered anyway. Her voice was as sharp and precise as ever, no pleasantries, just a barrage of clipped words, layered urgency, and thinly veiled frustration. The board is spooked. Rothman's threatening to walk. The valuation could shift by millions. And Jonathan, listen carefully, your signature is the only one they'll accept. No proxy, no delay. You have to come back. Now. Jonathan didn't respond at first. He watched the sun bleed orange across the hills of Willow Creek, watched Lena fold another crane in the corner, her movements soft and methodical, her silence louder than any accusation. Vanessa's voice pressed on rapid-fire, professional, controlled. You've been gone nearly 2 weeks. I've covered for you, stalled meetings, reassured stakeholders, but this deal is too big, and your absence is starting to cost us. If we lose Rothman, everything unravels: supply chains, subsidiaries, entire verticals. You know this. I know you're dealing with something personal, but you built this empire, Jonathan, and right now, it needs you. He felt the weight of her words and the deeper truth she didn't say aloud. This is who you are. This is where you belong. But even as she spoke, Jonathan turned slightly, eyes drifting to the worn chair where he had folded dozens of cranes, to the pale shape of Micah beneath white sheets, to the empty paper cup that Lena had left beside his laptop like a small offering. Everything in him tugged in two directions. One led back to Manhattan, to the world he understood: schedules, stakes, legacy. The other, unfamiliar and heavy, rooted him here in a quiet hospital beside children who didn't yet call him father, but needed him in ways no contract ever could. Vanessa paused, sensing his silence. Then softer. Please. We've come too far. You're the only one who can finish this. Jonathan closed his eyes. In his pocket, his pen, the one engraved with his initials and legacy, suddenly felt heavier than ever. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if signing that final line would make him feel powerful or profoundly empty. Jonathan's answer came not in haste, but in the kind of weighted silence that only a man at a crossroads could summon. He stood rooted near the hospital window, the phone pressed to his ear, staring blankly at the parking lot below, as the early morning light stretched long shadows across the asphalt. On the other end of the line, Vanessa was still talking, pushing figures, timelines, and warnings like weapons. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, deliberate, and unlike anything she expected. I'm not coming back. Not yet. For a second, there was only dead air. Then her voice cut through like ice. What did you just say? He didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Vanessa had known Jonathan Ellis for over a decade, knew his tone, his cadence, the way he never said anything twice because he didn't have to. She inhaled sharply, the fury rising beneath her carefully composed exterior. You are walking away from the biggest deal of your career because of a boy in a hospital bed and a girl who won't even look you in the eye. Her voice cracked slightly, not with emotion but with disbelief. Jonathan, they don't even know your name. You are nothing to them. Do you understand that he clenched his jaw but didn't respond? The truth of her words stung more than he wanted to admit. Micah still hadn't spoken a full sentence to him. Lena still flinched when he reached for her. They weren't his, not yet. Maybe never. But somehow that made staying feel even more necessary. Vanessa continued, her voice rising with each word, each syllable clipped like a slap. You are trading a legacy, a billion-dollar empire, years of blood negotiation power for 2 children who don't know your face. Are you even listening to yourself? Her anger wasn't just professional now, it was personal, almost visceral. She had bled for this company, fought wars behind boardroom doors, neutralized threats before Jonathan even saw them. And now he was choosing. What fatherhood regret? A chance at redemption that might never come. You always said the empire came first, she hissed. Now you're throwing it away for what guilt? Some fantasy that you can fix what you left broken 10 years ago. Still, Jonathan didn't respond. Not with excuses, not with apologies. Just the kind of silence that said everything. Vanessa exhaled sharply, the fury thick in her breath. Then don't come back. But don't expect this place to wait for you. When you walk away this time, you walk away for good. Ellis Holdings will move forward with or without you. She hung up before he could answer the line going dead in his hand. Jonathan lowered the phone, slowly staring at it as if it were a relic from another life. Behind him, Lena stood in the doorway, watching him, not speaking, just watching. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't trading an empire for 2 children. He was trading power for the chance to become something he had never dared to be, a father worth staying for. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind that bled slowly into itself without fanfare, where the hallway lights of the pediatric wing hummed and the nurses moved in a rhythm of hushed routine. Jonathan had just returned from grabbing a bitter cup of vending machine coffee, the kind that scalded the tongue and reminded him he was still tethered to this world, when he noticed the envelope, small, pale, and folded, once down the middle, tucked under Micah's bedside book. He frowned, picking it up, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Delicate, slightly slanted, the E-loops imperfect but full of familiar tension. Evelyn's handwriting. No note, no explanation, just his name. Not Jonathan in her usual casual shorthand, but Jonathan Ellis, formal, careful, like a final confession or a line drawn in quiet dignity. He turned it over, and as he opened the flap, he noticed movement in the doorway. Lena, small and silent as ever, stood there watching, not with fear or accusation, but a quiet kind of permission. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply nodded once, and he understood she had found it. She had read it, and she was choosing to let him see it. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the letter. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and age, the ink smudged in one corner, as if someone, maybe Evelyn, had hesitated while writing. The letter was short, painfully short. But each word landed like a stone in his chest. "Jonathan," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if you're here, it means something inside you still remembers, still wonders, maybe even still loves. So I'll ask this only once. Don't speak. Don't make promises. Don't write grand apologies or beg for forgiveness you haven't earned. If you still love me, if even a corner of your heart still holds the truth of us, then stay. Not for me. For them. For the 2 lives we made in silence in a world that never knew. Stay without needing to be thanked. Stay without asking for absolution. Stay because it's the only way to prove you ever truly cared. If you still love me, don't say it. Just show them. Show me. Stay." The room felt smaller as he finished reading, the weight of the paper somehow heavier than it had any right to be. Jonathan didn't cry, but he closed his eyes, breathed in, and something inside him cracked quietly, deeply. He folded the letter back gently, almost reverently, and looked up. Lena was gone. She had left him alone with his choice. Evelyn had always known him too well. Knew words meant little from a man like him. Knew only actions could be trusted. And now she had given him a final command, a final chance. Not to redeem the past, but to finally choose the present. Not with speeches, not with signatures, but with the simple, radical act of staying. The morning light filtered through the hospital blinds in soft, fractured beams, casting pale lines across the sterile floor and illuminating the quiet tableau that had taken shape in room 214. Micah stirred for the first time in days, his eyelids fluttering against the pull of sedation and fevered dreams. Machines blinked softly beside him, steady and unspectacular, but the moment his fingers twitched and his eyes opened, the world tilted back into motion. His gaze, unfocused, at first drifted across the room, before landing on the strange, beautiful chaos beside him, an entire table covered in paper cranes. They were everywhere. Some perfect, sharp-edged with clean folds, others lopsided or creased from tired hands and long nights. Each one bore a quiet story of presence of time spent instead of time saved. There were 999 of them, 99 of Lena had counted. Micah blinked again, the blur fading, his breath shallow but steady. He turned his head slightly drawn toward the silent army of folded birds, his brow furrowed not in fear or confusion, but in awe, as if somewhere deep within a part of him remembered why they mattered. The crane in Japanese folklore symbolized hope, healing, and the granting of wishes, 1,000 cranes for one heart's truest desire. He reached out, weakly, fingers trembling, and touched the edge of a pale blue one near the corner. The paper was soft from so many hands. Jonathan, asleep in the armchair nearby, didn't stir at first. His suit jacket hung limp on the back of the chair shirt. Wrinkled tie loosened. He had spent the night again, folding quietly into the early hours while Lena sat nearby, neither speaking, just folding. When Micah's hand moved again, more purposeful this time, Lena was the first to notice. She gasped softly, dropping the half-folded crane in her lap, eyes wide as she slid off the chair. "Micah," she whispered, voice cracking like a fragile branch. Jonathan jerked awake at the sound, startled eyes darting immediately toward the bed. When he saw his son's eyes open, saw the faint, confused smile that flickered across his lips. Something unspoken passed through him, a tidal wave of relief, guilt, awe, and the overwhelming realization that he had almost missed this moment forever. Micah turned his head, slowly saw Lena first. Then his eyes settled on Jonathan. No words came. None were needed. Instead, his hand lifted slowly and pointed toward the table. "Why are there only 999? He asked, voice hoarse but curious, tinged with childlike clarity. Jonathan stood, cleared his throat, and crossed the room in 2 steps. He knelt beside the bed, met his son's eyes for the first time in wakefulness, and answered softly, "Because I was waiting to fold the last one with you." Micah's voice, though still weak from days of illness and sleep, sliced cleanly through the stillness of the hospital room as he turned his head again, his eyes slowly scanning the vast field of paper cranes spread out beside his bed. He took in their shapes, delicate, creased, imperfect, in ways that made them feel alive, and then looked back at Jonathan with a gaze that was neither judgmental nor naive, but solemn, knowing, as though something deeper than language was pressing against the walls of his 9-year-old heart. "The last crane. Did you fold it yet, Dad?" He asked, his voice small but steady, and with that single question Jonathan felt the full weight of every missed year. Every abandoned moment crashed down around him. He blinked hard, caught off guard by the gentleness of the question, the quiet truth it carried, and how it somehow wasn't angry, not yet. He swallowed, leaned closer to the bedside, and tried to find words that wouldn't sound rehearsed or hollow. "No," he said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I haven't. I didn't want to finish without you." Micah looked at him for a long beat, then nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that was somehow more powerful than words. Jonathan reached into the small paper box on the edge of the table where Lena had carefully stacked fresh sheets in every color imaginable. He pulled out a single square of golden paper, the edges sharp, the surface untouched. He held it out, hesitant. "Would you help me?" Micah's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but something hopeful, something opening. With slow, tentative fingers, he took the square and held it between them. Jonathan guided him gently through each fold, just as he had learned himself in silence night after night, fingers stiff and clumsy from years of boardrooms instead of bedtime rituals. But this moment, unlike any deal or speech or legacy before, felt sacred. Fold after fold, the paper bent, creased, took form, not just into the shape of a crane, but into the fragile, stubborn shape of trust. Lena watched from the window seat, arms wrapped around her knees, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glinting with something new, maybe belief, maybe longing, maybe both. And when they finished, when the final crease had been pressed down and the golden crane stood upright between Jonathan and Micah, there was no applause, no grand orchestral swell, just the stillness of a hospital room where something broken had been mended quietly, where something lost had found its way back, not through explanation or apology, but through presence. Jonathan placed the 1,000th crane gently on the windowsill where the morning sun struck its wings and made them glow. Micah didn't say thank you, and Jonathan didn't expect it. The question had been answered. The final crane had been folded, and for the first time in 9 years, they had done something together, not as strangers, not as obligations, but as father and son. 1 year later, the once unshakable skyline of New York City had become a distant memory for Jonathan Ellis, replaced now by the slow, unhurried rhythm of Willow Creek. The morning light no longer filtered through penthouse glass or boardroom windows, but through the worn wooden slats of a modest farmhouse kitchen where coffee brewed on a chipped ceramic pot and the sound of birdsong replaced the hum of traffic. Jonathan had left everything Ellis Holdings, the penthouse, the legacy he once believed defined him, not in disgrace, not in haste, but in clarity. He had chosen to stay. Willow Creek, with its cracked sidewalks, aging water tower, and gossip that traveled faster than the mail, had become his home. The townspeople had stopped gawking months ago, surprised, but eventually softened by the sight of the man who once appeared on the cover of Forbes, now helping stack canned goods at the church pantry or fixing the squeaky hinge on the library door. His suits had been traded for rolled-up sleeves and worn boots. His phone, once tethered to his palm, now sat forgotten on a shelf most days collecting dust. Every morning began with pancakes burnt more often than not, and a lunchbox packed for Lena, who had finally begun calling him Dad, in a voice still cautious but no longer cold. Micah, now stronger, kept a notebook of new crane designs and had taken to explaining fractions using the folds. Jonathan listened, asked questions, stayed present. He still made mistakes, missed a field trip form, once undercooked the chicken twice, but he stayed. That more than anything had rewritten the story. Margaret, skeptical as ever, had stopped hovering and instead started inviting him to Sunday dinner without pointed remarks. The house Evelyn once lived in had been repaired room by room, not restored into something grand, but preserved gently, respectfully, each corner, infused with memory and intention. In the quiet of evenings after homework was done and dishes cleaned, Jonathan often sat on the porch with the twins watching the fireflies. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Being there every day, every night had said what 1,000 apologies never could. The building stood modestly at the edge of Willow Creek's main road, nestled between the elementary school and the old post office, its red brick facade catching the light of the afternoon sun. There was no grand ribbon cutting, no media coverage, no golden plaque bearing Jonathan Ellis's name. Instead, a simple wooden sign hung over the door, hand-carved and painted by the local high school art class, bearing 4 words that now carried the weight of an entire journey: the Grace Center for Families. Not Ellis Foundation. Not Clara Institute, as early drafts of the proposal once read. Jonathan had chosen the name deliberately. Grace Evelyn's middle name, the one she rarely used aloud, but had written in the margins of her notebooks on the back of envelopes, and once on a tiny slip of paper tucked inside a book she gave Lena. He remembered finding it after her death, the word Grace scribbled next to a line that read, "Love isn't about being seen, it's about staying." And so the center was born not as a monument to wealth or redemption, but as a living tribute to the woman who had done everything alone and without applause. The Grace Center offered free therapy, after-school tutoring, parenting support, and weekend meals. It was small, but it was full. Micah had painted a mural in the children's reading room, 1,000 paper cranes lifting into a night sky filled with constellations only he could name. Lena helped arrange the library shelves, choosing books she thought other kids would love and always making sure there were extras in the corner labeled, "Take one home." Jonathan didn't have an office at the center. He volunteered like everyone else, sweeping floors, reading aloud on Tuesdays, organizing donor supplies quietly in the back. He didn't talk about his old life unless asked. Most of the town already knew, but no one brought it up. What mattered was that he stayed. The Grace Center wasn't a second chance, it was a first one offered to the next Evelyns, the next Micahs and Lenas, who might otherwise be invisible. It stood humble but firm, not as an apology, but as a promise that grace once given should be given forward. The day of the dedication ceremony arrived with little fanfare, just as Jonathan had hoped, but the townspeople showed up anyway, lining the modest lawn in front of the Grace Center with folding chairs borrowed from the church and fresh-baked pies resting on picnic tables. It wasn't the kind of crowd Jonathan used to command. There were no investors or cameras, no luxury sedans waiting curbside, but there was something more sacred here present. Micah stood nervously at the makeshift podium, a wooden crate stacked beneath his feet to bring him eye level with the microphone. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his tie crooked, but he held his paper with steady hands. "My mom built this place." He began, his voice small but clear, not with bricks or money, but with the way she woke us up in the morning and packed 2 lunches even when we barely had one. She built it by staying. And even when she was tired or sick or scared, she never left. There was a hush as he paused, swallowing hard eyes, flicking toward Jonathan briefly. And now, someone else stayed too. The crowd turned toward Jonathan, who didn't move, didn't smile, didn't blink, just listened, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "So this place," Micah said, looking out across the rows of faces, "this place is for the people who stay, who show up, who keep folding cranes even when it hurts." A few scattered claps followed, then grew, building into full applause that filled the space with warmth. As Micah stepped down, Lena approached the front without a word. She wore a soft blue dress and held something cupped gently in her palms. Without speaking, she turned to Jonathan and opened her hands to reveal the 1,000th crane, white, perfectly creased, and no larger than a matchbox. She walked forward past the guests, past the microphone, and placed it at the foot of the mural inside the doorway. For a moment, everyone stood still. That single crane, simple and silent, spoke more than any speech. Jonathan felt the weight of it in his chest, the journey from absence to presence, from failure to quiet love, marked not by declarations, but by a folded promise left where it mattered most, home. After the crowd had dispersed and the folding chairs were being stacked by volunteers with sunburned forearms, Margaret remained behind, wandering the halls of the Grace Center in quiet awe. She moved slowly, her fingers grazing the walls painted by children's hands, pausing to admire the soft lighting, the reading nook filled with second-hand books, the framed photograph of Evelyn on the central pillar, smiling barefoot, holding Lena and Micah during a summer picnic no one had remembered capturing. Her heart swelled and ached all at once, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and something she hadn't dared feel for years: peace. It was when she followed the side corridor to the memorial garden that she noticed it. Tucked behind the main bench, carved delicately into the cedar panel where no one would see, unless they looked small, unobtrusive, but unmistakably there were the words, "Jonathan Ellis, Father Founder." No titles, no accolades, no dollar signs or corporate logos. Just that, simple, quiet, eternal. Margaret stared at the inscription, her breath catching in her throat. For a man whose name had once towered above skyscrapers and boardrooms, to choose this hidden place barely visible and not at all necessary spoke louder than any press release or public gesture. He hadn't done it for applause. He hadn't even told her. And in that moment, all the years of anger and resentment she'd held toward him began to loosen. She thought of the man who once walked away without a word, and the one who now spent his mornings packing lunches for children who weren't his, and folding laundry he used to outsource. She thought of Evelyn, her sister, her best friend, who had once begged for nothing but dignity and space to raise her children. Margaret dropped to the bench, one hand on the wooden plaque, and wept quietly. Not out of sadness, but because she finally believed it, he was staying, and his name etched not on glass or steel, but into the very grain of a place built on love and presence, was proof that even those who leave can learn how to come home. Sometimes the greatest legacies are not built in boardrooms or carved into skyscrapers, but whispered into bedtime stories, folded into paper cranes, and etched into the quiet corners of a place called home. Jonathan Ellis spent a lifetime chasing power, prestige, and profit, only to discover that the most meaningful title he'd ever carry was Father. This story reminds us that it's never too late to show up, not with money, not with apologies, but with presence. You can't undo the past, but you can choose how to live the next day and the next and the next. Relationships aren't repaired by grand gestures. They're built one ordinary act at a time, showing up to school plays, making dinner, folding laundry, staying through the hard silences. For anyone out there who feels they've waited too long to fix what's broken, know this: the door to redemption doesn't slam shut. It creaks open every time you take a step forward. And sometimes, all it takes is staying. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below and tell us, what does showing up mean to you? Save this video if it moved you. Follow our channel for more powerful emotional stories that remind us what really matters.